Chris, you recently took a trip, a really fascinating trip led by none other than Joel Rosenberg. Can you reflect a little bit on the purpose of that trip?
Well, Billy, it was fascinating. I went down with Joel Rosenberg, also went with Eric Steckelback of TBN, Dan Cohen of Newsmax, and a number of leaders you would recognize, like Carrie Summers, who actually helped fund the Museum of the Bible, and several others. It was a close-knit group. We really bonded while we were there, and it was an eye-opening experience for me. First time for me in Bahrain, in Manama, and we met many leaders there, like the Bahraini ambassador to the United States, the Minister of Interior. We met with an economic delegation there. For me, it was like watching the Abraham Accords unfolding. Yeah, you get this story, you get the idea that this is real. They consider this, historic. They consider this a real open door for the Middle East. One person described it like a pivot point in history. They really see it as profound change in the Middle East. And so it was a great aspect, insight into what's happening in the region.
Yeah, and you went to the UAE as well. And it's interesting to me looking at all of this. Obviously, we're watching it from afar. You were there getting a chance, as you said, to see that this was very real, that these peace accords, between Israel and these countries, I mean, this is one of the biggest things to come out of former President Donald Trump's presidency. I mean, this is a massive accomplishment that really nobody has been able to recognize up until this point. And so that's the big question. Just to sort of reiterate that piece, you were there, you saw this. A lot of people are still skeptical of the Abraham Accords, wondering how real is this? Is this really possible? Can you speak a little more to that?
Yeah, it's really genuine. You felt that in Bahrain. You felt that in the UAE. I'll give you one comment from, and a lot of this was off the record, Billy, and we didn't get as many interviews as we would have liked, but we got sort of these media sprays at the beginning of many of the meetings. But off the record, I could say on background, one leader described it like cousins getting to know one another. And it's really on that person-to-person basis. There are diplomatic accords right now. There's certainly, economic trade going on, but on a person-to-person basis. And that was one of the themes that we heard, is that these are people getting to know people. And this description of cousins getting to know one another describes it quite accurately about how people are getting to know one another. I'll tell you, Billy, I was coming back from the UAE. Flying back here to Israel, and on the flight tracker, when I was sitting in my seat, we're flying over Saudi Arabia. 5 years ago, that was unheard of. Who would have expected, plane from the UAE on their way to Tel Aviv? It just wasn't happening, and who knew what would happen? I remember coming back from the Far East, and you had to go all the way below the Arabian Peninsula to get back to Israel. So this is, wow, in so many logistical ways, practical ways, and people-to-people ways, the Abraham Accords is actually changing the face of the Middle East.
Yeah, and that, what you just said, my next question for you was going to be, you talk about a before and an after, right? What was life like before? And you just mentioned even the travel piece of it, but the general tone of how did these countries view one another, right? Can you talk about that a little bit before this historic agreement?
Well, there had been some relations with Israel, but they were covert. They were private. The Mossad actually had been working in both of these countries. There were behind the scenes connections, but now it's out in the open, and they're getting deep. I mean, we're almost 2 years into the Abraham Accords. Maybe more than $1 billion, and that was a figure several weeks ago. Trade going on between these countries, and tens of thousands of Israelis have visited, or maybe hundreds of thousands have visited the UAE and Bahrain, and it's really changing the face of the Middle East, as I said. And it's really these people-to-people relations that is going on. And I just found, a very sophisticated, a very modern places. The skyscrapers there are amazing in both places, in Abu Dhabi, where we were, in Manama. And if you realize that maybe 60 years ago, this was really desert, and before the discovery of oil in some of these places. And let me add one story about the UAE, Billy, which was just a profound story, and the impact of missionaries on the United Arab Emirates. In 1960, the mortality rate for newborns in the UAE was 50%. The mortality rate for women who were pregnant was 33%. By invitation, this missionary couple, some Baptists, a doctor and his wife, they came and they started working there. And the mortality rate began to drop. In fact, they were able to deliver the current crown prince. Because of the Christian missionaries coming, there's such a warmth between Christians and the royal family, and they credit this young couple who came when there was no modern conveniences in the blazing desert, and they sacrificed because of the love of Christ for these people, and really influenced a nation.
Wow. And see, that goes to show you the power that you can have and the change you can have as a Christian going where God calls you. That's an incredible story. And so the relations there, I was going to ask how you were all received on a spiritual sense. It seems like you were all received really well then.
Very much. Oh, we were honored. I remember we were at one dinner, breaking the Ramadan fast because we were there during Ramadan, and just this elegant dinner. We were warmly received almost every place we went, and it really was breaking bread with these leaders of the UAE and Bahrain that really set a tone that I think is going to lay a foundation for years to come. And the thing that was unifying all this was certainly the relationship with Israel, but also the threat of Iran. I mean, that's one of the factors bringing Israel and these Sunni Arab nations in the Gulf together, is that they have the mutual threat of Iran. One of the leaders we talked to, he said the top three threats to his country was Iran, Iran, Iran. So they realized how severe the threat is, just about 100 miles across the Gulf that they face, and that's one of the factors, as I said, bringing Israel and these nations together.
My last question for you, because often we go on these sorts of trips, and when you go as a journalist or as a host and you're going in and you're looking, there's a professional element to it, but the spiritual element of this, which is obviously deeply important. How did this trip impact you spiritually?
That's a great question. I think, you have a heart for these people when you see them face to face. When you meet these people, you may have preconceptions about how you'll be received or what they're like. As I said, there was just such a great warmth, and you have a compassion for these people. You have a sense of friendship, and you have a sense that you want to pray for these people, pray for the region, and here in Israel, pray for the peace of Jerusalem. So when you get to know these people face to face, heart to heart, you have more of a heart to be able to pray for them.
Well, Chris, as always, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your trip with us. Appreciate it.
Great to be with you, Billy.